A cold billionaire saw his pregnant ex freezing outside his luxurious Christmas party. One secret melted him and changed everything. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in a light so gentle yet so mighty that no sadness can touch her spirit. May He bless you with a peace that settles your heart, a strength that lifts your days, and a love so deep it heals every silent wound you carry. You are the heartbeat of every home, the wisdom behind every blessing, and the quiet miracle that keeps this world standing with grace. I pray your nights bring rest, your mornings bring hope, and your steps be guided by miracles you never expected. May every burden fall from your shoulders, every prayer find its answer, and every tear turn into a reason to smile again. You are worthy of honor, comfort, and endless tenderness, for everything you give, for everything you endure, for everything you are. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, write, I am with Mr. Peter. Martin Hewitt stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, champagne flute catching the crystalline light of 1,000 holiday decorations when he saw her. Sharon Grace. The woman he'd chosen his empire over 2 years ago was standing outside in the December cold, camera raised, photographing his building like she was documenting evidence for a trial that would end him. His hand froze mid-gesture as triumph drained from his veins and replaced itself with something ancient and terrible. Recognition, the kind that strips a man bare, regardless of how many zeros populate his bank account. Martin, the ambassador from Singapore, wants to discuss the Jakarta expansion, his business partner called from across the marble-floored great room where 300 of the world's most powerful people celebrated his European market breakthrough. Martin didn't turn, couldn't, because Sharon Grace, investigative journalist and the woman whose heart he'd abandoned like a forgotten briefcase, was standing in falling snow wearing a professional parka, wielding expensive camera equipment, and she wasn't looking up at his windows with longing. She was cataloging, documenting, building a case. He moved before thinking, grabbing his coat and ignoring the confused looks as he pushed through glittering bodies and descended via his private elevator. The December air hit him like accusation when he emerged onto the street. Sharon didn't startle when he approached. She simply lowered her camera and looked at him with eyes that had learned to see through expensive suits and recognize the poverty underneath. Martin. His name in her mouth was an autopsy report. Clinical. Detached. Final. Sharon, what are you doing here? She gestured to the building with one gloved hand, and he noticed her nails were painted deep burgundy now, instead of the soft pink she'd favored when they were together. Everything about her had sharpened, weaponized. Working. I'm documenting this structure for an investigative piece on corporate real estate acquisitions and the human cost of vertical expansion. Your building displaced 200 low-income families. Did you know that when you signed the purchase agreement? The question was a scalpel finding the exact right vein. That was handled by people you hired to handle things you didn't want to think about. Yes, that's exactly my point. She raised the camera again, and the shutter clicked with the finality of a judge's gavel. Martin's security detail emerged from the building. Sir, do you need this person removed? The word person, when referring to Sharon Grace, award-winning journalist, survivor of every hell his negligence had pushed her toward, and the only woman who'd ever made him feel like existing mattered, was so offensive he felt his hands curl into fists. No, what was she? Not his girlfriend, not his friend, not his anything. She's a journalist doing her job. Sharon's smile could have cut diamond. How generous, permitting me to work on a public street. She moved past him, and he caught the scent of her perfume. Different now. Not the soft vanilla she'd worn before, but something darker, with pepper and smoke. Survival had its own fragrance. Sharon, wait. Can we talk? She turned back, and in the amber glow of streetlights, he could see how the 2 years had carved her beautiful face into something more severe. She'd lost weight, gained angles, become geometric where she'd been curved. About what, Martin? About how you promised we'd go to my mother's birthday dinner and cancelled 4 times. About how you said you just needed to close the Singapore deal, and then we'd take that trip to Morocco, but the Singapore deal turned into the Seoul expansion, which turned into the Mumbai acquisition, which turned into you forgetting I existed. Or should we discuss how when I finally told you I couldn't keep waiting for a man who scheduled me like a quarterly earnings call, you said, "I understand," and went back to your spreadsheets. Each word was a counted bill he owed that had been accruing interest in the bank of her suffering. I was wrong, I know that now. You knew it then, Martin. You just didn't care enough to change. She pulled a business card from her pocket and handed it to him. The cardstock was heavy, expensive. Her name embossed in silver, Sharon Grace, Senior Investigative Reporter, specializing in corporate accountability and the men who evade it. I'm running a feature on your company's labor practices in your supplier factories. I spent 6 months embedded undercover documenting everything. It publishes Tuesday. Your lawyers will probably call it defamation. My lawyers will call it Pulitzer-worthy. We'll see who's right. She walked away without looking back. Her footprints in the fresh snow, the only evidence she'd been there at all. Martin stood on the street in his $5,000 suit, cooling champagne back in his penthouse, 300 powerful people waiting for him to return, and all he could think was that Sharon Grace had learned to walk away from him the way he'd once walked away from her. Easily. His business partner found him 10 minutes later, still standing in the snow. "Everything all right? Who was that?" Martin watched Sharon's car disappear around the corner, taillights bleeding red into white precipitation. "Someone I used to know." She looked angry. She looked like she knows me better than I know myself. And she's right. He returned to his party, but the champagne tasted like ashes and every conversation felt like noise, because Sharon Grace wasn't standing in his snow trying to get back into his world. She was standing in his snow preparing to expose what that world had cost everyone he'd stepped on while climbing toward it. And the most terrifying part was realizing she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice, which meant his name was just one entry in a ledger of men who'd mistaken ambition for virtue and wondered why the people they'd loved learned to document rather than forgive. Chapter 2. Some ghosts don't haunt you. They publish your sins in 10,000 words. The article went live at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, and by the time Martin's assistant brought him coffee at 8, his phone had recorded 217 missed calls. The headline, "The Human Cost of Hewitt Consolidated, How One Billionaire Built His Empire on Broken Promises," sat at the top of every major news aggregator, trending globally with the kind of velocity usually reserved for celebrity deaths and political scandals. Sharon hadn't just written an exposé, she'd written an execution. Martin read it 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of surgical precision. She'd documented labor violations in his supplier factories with testimony from workers who'd been injured and denied compensation. She'd traced his real estate acquisitions to displacement of vulnerable communities. She'd interviewed former employees who described a workplace culture of relentless pressure and emotional unavailability from leadership. But the most devastating section had nothing to do with business. It was a sidebar, written in Sharon's trademark precise prose, titled, "The Personal is Always Political, a Case Study in Abandonment." She didn't use his name, didn't need to. Everyone who knew them would recognize the story. Subject A was a mid-level analyst who dated a business school student. She supported his ambitions, attended his networking events, proofread his presentations. When he graduated and took a position at a consulting firm, he promised the grueling hours were temporary. 2 years later, she was still eating dinner alone. When she requested they schedule dedicated time together, he called her clingy. When she suggested couples therapy, he said he didn't have time to fix something that wasn't broken. When she finally ended the relationship, he said he understood and returned to his emails. 6 weeks later, her mother, drowning in gambling debts, accepted money from Subject A's mother to push the analyst into an arranged marriage with a wealthy businessman. The marriage lasted 8 months. The businessman was emotionally abusive. When he divorced her, her own mother refused to let her come home, calling her ungrateful for wasting a good opportunity. The analyst spent 3 months in a women's shelter, working as a night janitor while attending journalism school online. She slept 4 hours per night for 2 years. Subject A spent those same 2 years being profiled in business magazines as an emerging titan of industry. The analyst is now an award-winning investigative journalist. Subject A is now the subject of her investigation. Martin set down his phone with hands that had forgotten how to stay steady. His executive assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Mr. Hewitt, the board has called an emergency meeting for 9. Legal wants to discuss defamation action. PR wants to issue a statement denying. Schedule the board meeting, but not the legal consultation. We're not suing." "Sir, this article is damaging. This article is accurate." Martin looked at the woman who'd worked for him for 8 years and realized he didn't know if she had children, a partner, dreams beyond managing his calendar. "Cancel my appointments for today. All of them. All of them. Sir, you have the venture capital presentation at 2. Cancel it." When she left, Martin opened his laptop and searched Sharon's name. The results were staggering. 3 major journalism awards, a profile in a national magazine calling her the voice of accountability in corporate America. A photograph from her journalism school graduation where she looked exhausted and triumphant simultaneously, holding her degree like a weapon she'd forged in fire. While he'd been celebrating his European expansion last year, she'd been graduating top of her class from the shelter she'd called home. The board meeting was carnage. 7 members demanding legal action, his CFO suggesting they discredit Sharon by questioning her sources, his head of PR proposing a counter-narrative about vindictive ex-girlfriends. Martin let them talk for 30 minutes before speaking. "Everything in that article is verifiable fact. Our labor practices were exploitative. Our real estate acquisitions did displace families. I did deprioritize relationships for business advancement. Suing her won't change the truth. It'll just confirm we're exactly what she documented, people who choose profit over accountability." "So, what do you propose?" his CFO demanded. "We just accept this? Our stock price dropped 6% this morning. I propose we fix it. Every violation she documented, we remedy. Every worker injured, we compensate. Every policy that prioritizes margins over human dignity, we rewrite. That will cost. I don't care what it costs. Implement the changes." The room erupted. Martin stood, ending the meeting through the force of vertical authority that hierarchy still respected even when logic didn't. His mother called at 4 in the afternoon. Vivian Hewitt, former socialite and current board member, sounded like someone gargling broken glass mixed with old money condescension. "I assume you've seen the character assassination that bitter little journalist published. Her name is Sharon Grace. And it wasn't character assassination. It was documentation. She's destroying you because you had the sense to prioritize your career over some needy girl who wanted to play house. I told you then she wasn't suitable. You told me a lot of things, Mother. Most of them were designed to create the son you wanted instead of helping the person I actually was. Don't you dare blame me for your romantic failures. I don't blame you for the failure. I blame you for teaching me that people were obstacles to success instead of the point of it. Sharon saw through that. I didn't. That's on me." He ended the call. By evening, social media had turned his name into a trending topic. TikTok videos mocked him with side-by-side photos. Martin at galas, while Sharon was homeless. Twitter threads compiled his business magazine quotes about sacrificing personal comfort for professional excellence next to descriptions of her shelter experience. Someone had even created a viral video set to melancholic piano music, scrolling through the timeline of his rise and her suffering. The comments were brutal poetry. Imagine being so mediocre at being human that the woman you abandoned becomes more successful exposing you than you ever were exploiting people. He chose profit margins over the woman who's now exposing his profit margins. The irony is chef's kiss. Sharon Grace is what happens when you underestimate someone. She didn't get mad. She got credentialed, investigated, and published. Queen behavior. Martin didn't try to respond, didn't issue statements, just sat in his apartment, suddenly too large, too empty, too full of things he'd purchased instead of memories he'd made, and understood that Sharon Grace hadn't come to his building seeking reconciliation. She'd come to show him exactly what he'd become while she was busy surviving what he'd helped create. And there was no legal team expensive enough to defend against the truth. Chapter 3. When your past becomes everyone's entertainment, there's nowhere to hide. Martin discovered that being socially eviscerated happened in stages. First came the article, clinical, factual, devastating. Then came the social media explosion, creative, viral, inescapable. Then came the personal testimonials, and that's when he learned that Sharon's documentation of his failures was merely the opening argument in a trial where he couldn't defend himself because every witness was telling the truth. Women he'd dated casually after Sharon, brief encounters between business trips, dinners interrupted by phone calls, relationships that never progressed beyond surface compatibility, started sharing their experiences online, not coordinated, not malicious, just honest. Dated Martin Hewitt for 3 months. He took 7 business calls during our anniversary dinner and didn't understand why I was upset. When I ended things, he seemed genuinely confused that I expected emotional presence in addition to expensive restaurants. He cancelled our 4th date for a board meeting, rescheduled for 2 weeks later, then cancelled again for a different meeting. I asked if he actually wanted to date or just have someone available when his schedule permitted. He said, "Isn't that what dating is?" I realized he genuinely believed relationships were appointments you could reschedule indefinitely. The stories painted a picture of a man who approached human connection like contract negotiations, something to optimize, schedule, and deprioritize when higher value opportunities emerged. His college girlfriend from 15 years ago did an interview with a lifestyle blog. She'd become a successful architect, married with children, no apparent axe to grind, just memory served cold. Martin was charming and ambitious. I supported him completely, helped him study, attended his networking events, introduced him to my father's business connections. When I had a gallery opening for my architecture thesis, he missed it for a study group. I cried in the bathroom all night. When I told him how hurt I was, he said it was just a school project and there would be other openings. There weren't. That was my senior thesis, my proudest work. And he chose reviewing case studies with classmates over witnessing my achievement. I should have known then that his ambition would always consume everything else. I'm glad I left before I became Sharon Grace, surviving his negligence instead of just disappointed by it. Martin read each account with the slow-building horror of a man discovering he'd been committing crimes he didn't know were illegal, except these weren't legal violations, they were moral ones, the kind that couldn't be remedied with compliance departments and policy changes. His social calendar evaporated, invitations to galas were quietly withdrawn, his usual table at exclusive restaurants was suddenly unavailable for the foreseeable future. Former friends stopped returning calls. The social ecosystem that had celebrated his rise was now performing collective amnesia about ever knowing him. The business conference where he'd been scheduled as a keynote speaker uninvited him via a terse email citing recent reputational concerns. The charity board he'd sat on for 6 years asked for his resignation to avoid distracting from the organization's mission. Only his company remained, and even that was fracturing. 3 board members resigned. 2 major investors threatened to pull funding if he didn't get ahead of the narrative. The breaking point came when someone found a video from a business conference 5 years ago, Martin on a panel about work-life balance, young and confident, and catastrophically wrong. Work-life balance is a myth perpetuated by people without the courage to sacrifice for greatness. I'll sleep when I'm successful. I'll vacation when I've built something worth stepping away from. The people who complain about long hours are the same people who wonder why they're not in leadership. You can't build an empire and maintain a comfortable personal life simultaneously. Choose one. The video had 3 million views in 24 hours. The comments were archaeological excavations of his arrogance. This video aged like milk in the sun. The woman he sacrificed for his empire, she's now more successful than him, and she has integrity. Guess you can have both, Martin. You just chose neither. Sharon didn't comment on any of it publicly, didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than engagement. She'd published her investigation, cited her sources, and moved on to her next story while the internet dissected his character without her assistance. But Martin saw her once, accidentally, at a coffee shop near his office. She was with Julian Reeves, the non-profit director she'd been photographed with, the man who looked at her like she was the entire point of his day. They were laughing at something on Julian's phone, comfortable and easy in a way Martin had never managed. Julian said something that made Sharon throw her head back with genuine delight, her laughter bright and unguarded, and Martin felt something he hadn't experienced in his entire climb to billionaire status. The understanding that he'd traded something irreplaceable for things that could be quantified. Sharon spotted him on her way out. Julian held the door while she paused, considering whether to acknowledge Martin's presence. She walked over, not aggressive, just curious, in the way someone might examine a museum exhibit about extinct civilizations that destroyed themselves through hubris. Martin. Sharon, What? What could he possibly say? I read the article, multiple times. And? Every word was accurate. Something flickered across her face. Not satisfaction. More like sadness that accuracy and destruction were synonymous when documenting his choices. I didn't write it for you. I wrote it for the workers you exploited and the people you taught that human connection was a low-priority agenda item. You were just the case study. I know, but I want you to know. I'm implementing changes. Everything you documented, I'm fixing. That's good. You should fix things that are broken. That's basic decency, not redemption. Julian appeared at her shoulder, politely protective. Sharon introduced them with the kind of easy grace that communicated she'd moved on so completely that Martin wasn't even a source of tension anymore, just an awkward encounter with someone she used to know. We should go, Julian said gently. Reservations in 20 minutes. Sharon nodded, then looked back at Martin one last time. I hope you become someone different. Not for me, I've moved on. But for yourself. Because the man I documented in that article, he's not someone I'd want to be. She left with Julian, their hands finding each other naturally, and Martin stood in the coffee shop understanding that Sharon Grace had done something more devastating than expose him. She'd survived him, thrived beyond him, and made it clear his significance in her life was historical rather than present. He was a footnote in her origin story. The villain she'd defeated by becoming successful enough to document his failures without needing his validation to matter, and that truth hurt more than any social media roasting possibly could. Chapter 4. Forgiveness isn't owed to men who finally notice you're magnificent. Martin's mother hosted her annual charity gala in February with the kind of aggressive normalcy that suggested nothing had changed, despite everything being fundamentally different. The event benefited women's entrepreneurship, an irony so thick Martin could have spread it on toast, and Vivian had always treated the evening as a showcase of Hewitt family philanthropy rather than actual charitable concern. Martin attended out of obligation and immediately regretted it. The room was full of people who'd read Sharon's article, seen the social media dissection, and now regarded him with the particular fascination reserved for train wrecks and fallen empires. Then Sharon walked in, and the ballroom's energy shifted like weather systems responding to atmospheric pressure changes. She wore an emerald gown that made her skin glow like polished mahogany, her natural hair styled in an elaborate updo that framed her face like a crown. Julian accompanied her, handsome and attentive, and together they looked like the kind of couple that magazines photographed for aspirational lifestyle features. Martin learned she was the evening's guest of honor from the program notes. The charity board had invited her over Vivian's strenuous objections, recognizing that Sharon's profile would attract media attention and donations. His mother had lost that battle, and judging by her expression when Sharon entered, was still angry about the defeat. People swarmed Sharon immediately. Business leaders who'd once attended Martin's parties now competed for her attention, asking about her investigative methods, praising her courage, offering connections and opportunities. She handled it with grace, acknowledging compliments without false modesty, engaging in conversations that suggested she belonged in these rooms, not because someone had granted her access, but because she'd earned it. When Sharon took the stage for her keynote, the room quieted with genuine attention rather than polite obligation. 2 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything to prove. I stood outside a building in the snow, looking up at a Christmas party I wasn't invited to. The building belonged to someone who'd once promised me I mattered, but whose actions consistently communicated the opposite. I stood there taking photographs for an investigation, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I'd once begged this person for time, and now I was voluntarily spending my time documenting his failures. Martin's chest constricted. Every eye in the room flickered toward him before returning to Sharon. Tonight I'm speaking at an event I was invited to. In a room full of people who value my work. Wearing a gown I purchased with money I earned through skills I developed during the hardest period of my life. And I'm thinking about all the women who've stood outside their own metaphorical buildings, looking up at parties they weren't invited to, wondering why the people who should have valued them chose literally anything else. She paused, letting the weight settle. We talk about women's entrepreneurship like it's an abstract concept, but for many of us, entrepreneurship wasn't a choice. It was survival. We built businesses because traditional employment wouldn't accommodate childcare needs. We started consulting firms because corporate hierarchies excluded us. We became journalists because someone needed to document the truth even when it was uncomfortable. We didn't choose entrepreneurship out of ambition. We chose it out of necessity when the systems designed by men like... She gestured vaguely toward Martin's section of the room. Failed to make space for us. The applause was immediate and sustained. Vivian looked like she'd swallowed glass. Martin felt every word like surgical incisions, precise, necessary, painful. Sharon continued for 20 more minutes, weaving statistics about women's economic participation with personal narrative about rebuilding from abandonment, creating a speech that was simultaneously academic and deeply human. When she finished, half the room stood in ovation. Martin waited until the crowd thinned before approaching her in a side hallway. Sharon was alone briefly, checking her phone, and looked up when his shadow fell across her path. That was a powerful speech. Thank you. Polite. Distant. The tone you'd use with a stranger who complimented your shoes. I wanted to apologize. Martin, stop. She held up one hand, and her nails were still that burgundy color that looked like controlled violence. I don't want your apology. I don't need it. I don't accept it. What I want is for you to understand that you're not the main character in my story anymore. You're context. You're the before. I'm living in the after, and it's infinitely better without you trying to insert yourself into it with apologies that make you feel better, but do nothing for me. I'm not trying to make myself feel better. Yes, you are. That's what apologies are when they come after someone becomes too successful to ignore. They're not about remorse. They're about ego management. You're sorry I documented your failures publicly. You're not sorry you committed them privately. Julian appeared, 2 champagne flutes in hand, and offered one to Sharon, with the kind of casual intimacy that spoke of inside jokes and late-night conversations and all the small moments Martin had considered too insignificant to prioritize. Everything okay? Julian's question was directed at Sharon, not Martin, which was its own form of dismissal. Fine. Martin was just leaving. Martin should have left. Would have. If not for the desperate need to understand how Sharon had become this person, armored and magnificent and completely beyond his reach. How did you do it? How did you survive what happened and become this? Sharon's smile was archaeological, something preserved from before she'd learned that survival required weaponizing competence. I didn't have a choice. When you have nothing left, you either die or build. I chose building. Every day I chose building. And eventually I built something so solid that men like you couldn't knock it down even when you tried. Which you didn't, because you forgot I existed. So I built in peace. And now my foundation is stronger than your empire ever was, because mine is constructed from necessity rather than ego. She walked away with Julian, leaving Martin in the hallway, understanding that he hadn't just lost Sharon. He'd lost the opportunity to ever know the person she'd become. That version of her was built specifically in opposition to the environment he'd created, which meant he couldn't exist in proximity to her evolved self without contradicting the conditions that created her. Near the bar, he encountered Sharon's friends, 3 women who regarded him with the collective energy of a jury that had already reached a verdict. The divorce lawyer spoke first. "Martin Hewitt, Sharon's mentioned you. Well, she's mentioned what you represented. Lessons learned. Behaviors to avoid. That sort of thing." The therapist tilted her head, examining him like a case study. "It's fascinating how men like you only develop emotional availability after the relationship ends, almost like you're capable of growth but only when forced by consequences." The boutique owner just smiled, cold and amused. She's happy now, really happy, the kind of happy that doesn't require expensive gifts or grand gestures, just consistent presence from someone who understands that love is a verb requiring regular practice. You should try that with your next relationship, if you're capable of learning. They left him standing alone with his drink, and Martin understood that Sharon hadn't just moved on. She'd built an entire community of women who'd survived men's negligence and created something better in the aftermath. He wasn't their villain. He was their cautionary tale, the one they referenced when teaching each other what to avoid. And somehow that was worse than being hated, being forgotten as anything other than a mistake someone else had learned from. Chapter 5. The price of redemption is everything you built while running. Martin didn't announce his reforms with press releases or grand statements. He started by reading every worker testimony Sharon had cited in her article, every injury report his HR department had filed and forgotten, every complaint that had been marked resolved without actual resolution. He spent 2 weeks doing nothing but reading, and by the end, he understood why Sharon's article had been merciful. The reality was worse than she'd documented. Workers injured and fired for missing shifts during recovery. Single mothers passed over for promotions because they might need flexible schedules. Supplier factories he'd never visited because the cost savings were too attractive to question. A culture where employees learned to suffer silently because speaking up meant being labeled not a team player. Martin started with the smallest changes, commissioned independent safety audits at every facility, instituted anonymous reporting systems, real ones, not the performative suggestion boxes that previous management had installed and ignored, increased base wages by increments his CFO called fiscally irresponsible. Then he did something his entire career had trained him to avoid. He visited a supplier factory personally. The facility was in an industrial zone 2 hours outside the city. The building was legal, technically, met minimum safety standards technically, but walking through it, seeing workers operating machinery in conditions he wouldn't tolerate for his office furniture, breathing air thick with chemical residue, taking bathroom breaks on timers, made Martin understand that legal and ethical occupied different universes. He returned to his office and expanded healthcare coverage to include supplier employees. His board requested an emergency meeting. This will cost millions, then it costs millions. Over 6 months, Martin implemented comprehensive labor reforms, living wages that exceeded market rates, healthcare that covered families, profit-sharing structures that distributed wealth beyond executive compensation, parental leave policies that didn't penalize women for biology. The pushback was immediate and brutal. His CFO quit, calling the changes emotional decision-making. 2 board members followed within days. Major investors filed formal complaints about breach of fiduciary duty. Martin's stock portfolio lost 40% of its value in those 6 months. The business magazines that had once profiled him as an emerging titan now ran pieces about his costly moral awakening and questioned whether conscience was compatible with capitalism. His mother called on a Tuesday evening, her voice sharp with aristocratic fury. "You're destroying everything I taught you to build, everything I sacrificed to create. You taught me that people were obstacles, that relationships distracted from legacy, that winning justified any cost. I learned those lessons perfectly, Mother, so perfectly that I destroyed the one relationship that mattered and built an empire on suffering you taught me to consider acceptable collateral damage. That journalist has poisoned you. Sharon didn't poison me. She held up a mirror, and I'm looking at what stared back. You're dismantling your legacy. I'm dismantling your legacy. Mine doesn't exist yet. I'm trying to build one that doesn't require other people's suffering as its foundation." He ended the call. The board meeting happened on a Thursday morning. The conference room felt different now, less like a temple of capitalism and more like a tribunal. The chairman opened with projections: revenue down 18%, operational costs increased by regulatory compliance beyond legal requirements, market capitalization decreased from investor exodus, stock price dropping daily. These reforms are financially unsustainable. The chairman concluded. "We're asking for your resignation effective immediately, with a 6-month transition period to new leadership." Martin looked at the 9 faces around the table, people he'd worked with for years, built relationships with, trusted with his company's direction. None of them would meet his eyes except one, Octavia Sterling, the newest board member who'd joined last year after selling her tech startup. "Before you vote," Martin said quietly, "I want you to understand what you're actually voting on. You're not choosing between profit and principle. You're choosing whether this company's legacy is built on exploitation or integrity. Sharon Grace's article wasn't propaganda, it was documentation. Every violation she cited was verifiable fact. We built this by externalizing costs onto vulnerable people and calling it operational efficiency. I'm not destroying our legacy, I'm correcting it. And if you can't support that correction, then your resignation would be more appropriate than mine." The chairman bristled. "You're being unreasonable. I'm being accountable. There's a difference." The vote was 7-2 in favor of his resignation. Only Octavia and one other member voted to keep him. Martin cleaned out his office that afternoon, his employment at the company he'd built ending with a cardboard box of personal effects and a security escort to ensure he didn't access sensitive files. The media coverage was predictable, half calling him a martyr for corporate responsibility, half calling him a naive idealist who'd destroyed shareholder value through emotional decision-making. Sharon's publication ran an analysis piece: Martin Hewitt's Reforms, Genuine Change or Damage Control. She didn't write it, but the piece interviewed skeptical workers and concluded whether Hewitt's reforms represent authentic transformation or elaborate reputation management remains to be seen. Time will tell if his commitment outlasts the news cycle. Martin read it and understood. She wasn't giving him credit because credit required sustained proof beyond initial gestures. He sold his penthouse apartment and moved to a modest 2-bedroom in a less exclusive neighborhood, sold his luxury car and bought something practical, liquidated his art collection, wine cellar, watch collection, all the status symbols that had meant everything and nothing simultaneously. With the proceeds, he established a foundation funding education for workers displaced by corporate restructuring. Not in his name, anonymous. Because one thing Sharon had taught him through her absence, redemption wasn't performed for audiences. It was practiced in rooms where no one was watching. Weeks became months. Martin's former business associate stopped returning calls. His mother published an op-ed calling him a cautionary tale of how weakness masquerading as morality destroys generational wealth. His social media mentions oscillated between admiration for his apparent growth and skepticism about his motivations. Through a mutual acquaintance, he learned Sharon was being harassed by Randolph Sterling, her ex-husband, recently released on bail, furious about her reporting on his fraud. Randolph was using wealth and connections to intimidate her, filing frivolous lawsuits, sending threatening messages through intermediaries. Martin still had information on Randolph from their overlapping business circles, but using it would require a choice he'd spent his entire career avoiding, choosing what was right over what was strategic. He sat with that decision for 3 days before making it. Chapter 6. Some sons choose truth over mothers, and the fallout is nuclear war. Martin found the contract while closing out his executive access to company servers, a routine financial review that suddenly looked different through reformed eyes. Wire transfers from Vivian to an account belonging to Delilah, Sharon's mother. $200,000, itemized as consulting services. With a contract attachment that made Martin's stomach turn, he read it 3 times to make sure he understood what his mother had done. She'd paid Sharon's mother to arrange Sharon's marriage to Randolph Sterling, specifically by name, with payment schedules tied to wedding date, marriage duration, and successful resolution of the Sharon situation. Martin sat in his smaller apartment, contract printouts spread across his kitchen table, and understood that Sharon's trauma hadn't been tragic coincidence. It had been purchased by his mother, using family money, to remove an obstacle from his career path. He appeared at his mother's residence unannounced on a Thursday morning, contract in hand. Vivian was surprised but composed. "Martin, I wasn't expecting... You paid Sharon's mother to push her into marriage with Randolph Sterling." The silence that followed had the weight of collapsed civilizations. "I don't know what you're... I found the contract, wire transfers, everything. You orchestrated her trauma because you perceived her as an obstacle to my career advancement." Vivian's face went through rapid calculations, denial, justification, rage, before settling on cold defiance. "I did what was necessary. That girl was dragging you down, making you question your priorities, turning you into someone who thought relationships mattered more than legacy building. They do matter more. That's the entire revelation you can't grasp. She survived, didn't she? She's fine. Better than fine. She's successful and vindictive, and building her career destroying men's reputations. She survived despite you, and the fact that you interpret her survival as justification for your cruelty, rather than evidence of her resilience, tells me everything I need to know about your value system. So what now? You're going to punish me for protecting your interests? I'm removing you from the board, severing your financial connections to any company I have influence over, and making it clear to anyone who asks that your philosophy of success at any cost is exactly what created the violations Sharon documented." His mother stood, rigid with aristocratic fury. "You'll regret this. That woman has made you weak, and weakness gets punished in our world. Then I'll be punished, but I won't be you." She left, and Martin understood he'd just detonated the primary relationship of his first 30 years. But keeping Vivian in his professional life while claiming moral evolution was hypocrisy too blatant to stomach. The board removal process took 3 weeks and required legal maneuvering that cost him additional attorney fees. Vivian fought every step, threatening litigation and public scandal. Martin had documentation, including her payments to Delilah, which made her threats hollow. When the removal finalized, Vivian retaliated with a press interview that went viral immediately. "My son is experiencing a mental health crisis," she told a sympathetic journalist from a conservative business magazine. "He's destroyed billions in shareholder value, alienated every business contact he cultivated, and sacrificed his career for the approval of a vindictive ex-girlfriend who's built her brand on attacking successful men. I'm deeply concerned for his psychological state." The article's headline, "Vivian Hewitt, Billionaire's Mother Speaks Out About Son's Breakdown Following Journalist's Expose." The interview included thinly veiled suggestions that Sharon had manipulated Martin emotionally and professionally, that her article was motivated by personal vendetta rather than journalistic integrity, that Martin's reforms were symptoms of instability rather than accountability. Social media erupted. half defended Vivian as a concerned mother, half recognized the attack for what it was, a powerful woman punishing her son for choosing ethics over empire. Sharon's response came 3 hours after the article published, posted on her social media with the kind of surgical precision that had made her journalism legendary. Vivian Hewitt called me vindictive and suggested I've manipulated her son. Interesting choice of words from a woman who paid my mother $200,000 to force me into an abusive marriage because she saw me as an obstacle to her son's career trajectory. I have documentation, bank records, signed contracts. Should I publish them, or would you like to retract your statement and apologize for orchestrating trauma you're now pretending didn't happen? The post included one attachment, a PDF of the contract between Vivian and Delilah, with both signatures clearly visible and every payment meticulously documented. The internet went thermonuclear. Within 6 hours, Vivian's name was trending globally. Legal analysts appeared on news shows discussing potential criminal implications of paying someone to coerce their daughter into marriage. Mental health advocates condemned Vivian's weaponization of mental illness terminology to discredit legitimate accountability. Women's rights organizations called for investigations into whether Vivian's actions constituted human trafficking. Martin's phone exploded with calls from reporters, former colleagues, and distant relatives he'd forgotten existed. He ignored all of them except one text from Sharon. "I published the contract. I'm sorry if that complicates things with your family, but she attacked my credibility, and I don't let attacks stand without evidence." Martin responded immediately. "Don't apologize, you documented the truth. That's what you do. Thank you for that." Her response came after a long pause. "Are you okay? I know she's your mother, regardless of what she's done." "I'm better than okay. I'm free. She can't hurt me anymore because I've chosen truth over her approval. That's the best inheritance she never intended to give me." 3 days later, Vivian published a second statement through her attorney, a retraction of her comments about Sharon and a terse acknowledgement that personal matters were handled inappropriately years ago. No apology, just legal maneuvering to avoid lawsuits. But the damage was irreversible. Vivian's reputation, built on decades of charity galas and social positioning, crumbled under documentation that she'd trafficked a young woman for convenience. Her board positions at other companies requested her resignation. Her social circle contracted to only those willing to overlook paying someone to destroy their child's relationship. Martin's relationship with his mother died that week, not with confrontation, but with silence. She stopped calling. He stopped hoping she'd develop conscience. They existed in separate worlds connected only by biology and a shared history of her teaching him everything wrong about success. Sharon's publication ran a follow-up article about Vivian's actions, contextualizing them within broader patterns of wealthy families, treating working-class individuals as obstacles to be eliminated rather than humans with agency. The piece was devastating and meticulously researched, citing the contract as primary evidence while interviewing other women who'd experienced similar coercion from wealthy families. Martin read it twice, understanding that Sharon had done something remarkable. She'd taken her personal trauma and transformed it into journalism that protected other women from similar exploitation. She'd weaponized her survival into systemic change, and she'd done it without needing his permission, validation, or involvement, which was exactly as it should be. Late one evening, after the media firestorm had subsided into background noise, Martin received a text from Delilah, Sharon's mother, whom he'd never met, but whose signature shared space with his mother's on a document that had changed Sharon's life. "I'm in therapy now. Sharon and I are rebuilding our relationship. It's slow and hard, and I don't deserve her forgiveness. But I want you to know, I'm sorry. For taking that money, for failing my daughter, for being part of your mother's cruelty. I can't undo it, but I'm trying to become someone who wouldn't do it again." Martin saved the message but didn't respond. Delilah's redemption wasn't his to validate. That was between her and Sharon. but it reminded him that change was possible even for people who'd committed terrible betrayals. The question wasn't whether people could change, it was whether they'd put in years of work when no one was watching to become different than they'd been, and whether the people they'd hurt would ever trust that change was genuine. Martin was discovering that the answer to the second question mattered less than the commitment to the first. Chapter 7. The man who learned to beg did it on his knees, publicly. The Business Ethics Conference invitation arrived in September with institutional legitimacy suggesting someone believed Martin had something valuable to contribute beyond serving as a cautionary tale. He almost declined. Public speaking now felt like performance art, where he was both actor and subject, but the conference organizer's note was persuasive. "We don't want you to defend yourself. We want you to tell the truth about how corporate culture creates men who treat people like spreadsheet line items. Most speakers at these events preach about ethics they've always practiced. You can talk about ethics you learned to practice after devastating consequences. That's more valuable." Martin accepted. Prepared no notes. Just stood on a stage in front of 300 business leaders and decided that if he was going to exist publicly, he'd exist honestly. "I'm not here to talk about my company's reforms," he began, voice steady despite hands shaking in his pockets. "I'm here to confess." The room quieted with the particular silence that precedes revelation. "For 15 years I built an empire on one principle: success justifies everything. I didn't count costs because other people paid them. Workers injured in my supplier factories that I never bothered to visit. Families displaced by my real estate acquisitions that I never questioned. A woman who loved me and asked for time I considered too valuable to waste on emotional maintenance." He paused, finding his breath in the stifling conference center air. "I had a partner, not a business partner, a life partner. She asked me to prioritize our relationship. I told her I was building our future through my career success. She asked for consistency. I gave her cancellations and reschedulings. She asked if I could make space for both ambition and connection. I told her she was being unrealistic about what building empires required." The audience was completely still now, and Martin recognized several faces that had once been in his business network, back when he had a business network. When she finally left, I felt relieved, unburdened, free to focus on what I'd convinced myself mattered. I didn't follow up, didn't check on her, didn't care that I'd heard through acquaintances she was struggling, because in my mind, struggling meant she lacked my work ethic and vision. His voice cracked, and he didn't hide it, didn't smooth it over, let 300 people see him break. She ended up in a shelter. I ended up in Forbes. And I told myself those outcomes were logical extensions of our different priorities. She prioritized relationships. I prioritized results. The market rewarded me and punished her, which I interpreted as proof I'd been right all along. Except I wasn't right. I was monstrous. And I didn't realize it until she became an investigative journalist and published an article documenting exactly how monstrous I'd been. Not just to her, to everyone whose suffering I'd considered acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of shareholder value. He looked directly at the audience, meeting eyes that had once sought his mentorship and now regarded him with fascination typically reserved for objects in museums about civilizations that destroyed themselves. "I'm not reformed, I'm ashamed, and I'm trying to build something that doesn't require other people's suffering as its foundation. Not because I'm noble, because I have to live with who I was, and that person is unbearable to inhabit. Every policy change I've implemented, every worker I've compensated, every resource I've redirected from executive pay to labor protections, none of that erases what I did. It's just evidence I finally understood what should have been obvious from the beginning, that people aren't obstacles to success. They're the entire point of it." The silence stretched and stretched. "That journalist who exposed me? Her name is Sharon Grace. She survived what my negligence enabled, built a career documenting men like me, and made it clear she doesn't want my apology, doesn't need it, doesn't accept it, and she's absolutely right to refuse, because apologizing after you're caught isn't remorse, it's reputation management. So I'm not apologizing to her. She's moved on. built a life that doesn't include space for my guilt. What I'm doing is confessing to all of you, to anyone in this room who's made the same calculations I did, who's told themselves that relationships can wait, that people can be rescheduled, that love is less important than leverage. You can't reschedule people. They move on. They survive you. And if you're lucky, or unlucky depending on your perspective, they become powerful enough to document your failures publicly. Sharon Grace didn't destroy me. She revealed me. And that revelation is the most valuable thing anyone's ever done for me, because it made continuing to be that person impossible. He stepped back from the microphone, and the applause that followed was confused, not celebratory, just acknowledgement that they'd witnessed something rare. Complete honesty about failure without self-protective caveats or redemption narrative framing. The speech went viral within hours, 25 million views by midnight. Business outlets ran competing analyses about whether public confession constituted genuine accountability or sophisticated image rehabilitation. Social media split between praising his transparency and questioning whether someone who'd caused such harm deserved platforms for redemption narratives at all. Sharon watched from her office. Colleagues gathered around her computer as the view count climbed exponentially. "That wasn't performance," Imani said quietly, rewinding to watch his voice break again. "That was real." Keisha nodded slowly. "He didn't say your name until he'd established the full context of why you don't want it. That's something." Jade looked at Sharon, therapist's eyes reading micro-expressions. "How do you feel watching this?" Sharon's face was complicated territory. Not angry, not satisfied. Something closer to exhausted recognition of transformation she'd witnessed but couldn't yet trust. "I feel like he's finally becoming someone I might have respected if he'd been that person from the beginning. Which doesn't change what happened, but maybe complicates my understanding of what's happening now." She published an analysis piece the next day. When Men Confess, Accountability or Performance. The article examined Martin's speech alongside other public apologies from business leaders, discussing authenticity markers versus strategic reputation management techniques. Her conclusion was measured. Confession is easy. Changed behavior over years without audience validation is hard. Martin Hewitt's speech demonstrated honesty about past failures. Whether his honesty translates into sustained ethical practice beyond the spotlight remains observable. History doesn't grade on potential. It grades on results measured over time. Martin read the article 3 times and understood with perfect clarity. Sharon wasn't giving him credit for the speech. She was giving him space to prove whether his confession meant something beyond the 25 million views and favorable commentary it had generated. And that space, that withholding of judgment while keeping the door microscopically ajar for evidence of sustained change, was more generous than anything he'd earned through 15 years of empire building or 1 hour of public confession. Chapter 8. The difference between sorry and sacrifice is what you're willing to lose. Randolph Sterling made bail in late October through the kind of legal maneuvering that money purchases when justice is theoretically blind but practically expensive. Sharon learned about it through a terse notification from the prosecutor's office, and within 48 hours, Randolph's lawyers had filed defamation suits against her and her publication for the fraud reporting that had contributed to his initial arrest. Sharon had faced legal threats before, occupational hazard of investigative journalism, but Randolph's approach was different, more aggressive, more personal, designed not to win in court, but to exhaust her resources and credibility through procedural warfare that could drag on for years. Private investigators started following her. She noticed them third day, too obvious to be competent, which meant they wanted her to notice, wanted her to feel watched. Anonymous online accounts began posting accusations, questioning her journalistic ethics, her sources, her motivations. Randolph gave interviews to friendly outlets, suggesting Sharon had fabricated evidence out of personal vindictiveness toward her ex-husband. Her publication provided legal support and security detail, but the stress was invasive and constant. Every interaction felt surveilled. Every article she published got scrutinized for potential defamation liability. The work she loved became complicated by the man she'd once been legally bound to and had spent years escaping. Martin heard about it through former business contacts who still occasionally kept him informed about corporate developments, despite his fall from grace. He knew Randolph casually, overlapping social circles back before Martin's public reckoning, and more relevantly, he knew where Randolph kept his actual assets, the offshore accounts. The shell corporations registered in jurisdictions with convenient privacy laws. The financial architecture designed to hide wealth from regulators and ex-wives and anyone else with legitimate claims. Martin had used similar structures years ago when building his empire through whatever means made the quarterly numbers look impressive, which meant he had comprehensive knowledge of how they worked and, more importantly, where Randolph's particular version was vulnerable to exposure. He also knew with absolute certainty that providing this information would expose his own past participation in identical schemes. The federal investigation into his finances had focused on tax evasion and labor violations, but had missed the offshore holdings because Martin had cooperated quickly on everything else, and those accounts predated the investigation's initial scope. Reopening that door meant risking indictment for financial crimes that could result in actual prison time rather than just probation and fines. His lawyer was explicit and emphatic about the risks. You provide this information to anyone, and federal investigators will trace your own involvement back through those same banking systems. These accounts operate through infrastructure you used extensively between 2008 and 2014. You'll be implicating yourself in fraud, systematic tax evasion, possibly money laundering depending on how aggressively prosecutors interpret the transaction patterns. What are Sharon's chances of winning her cases without this information? Decent. Her reporting was solid, and truth is an absolute defense against defamation. But Randolph's lawyers are expensive and experienced at weaponizing legal process. She'll win eventually, but it might take 3 to 5 years and cost her publication hundreds of thousands in legal fees, maybe millions if it goes to trial. And with this information, his cases collapse immediately. The evidence you have shows clear bail violations and undisclosed assets that invalidate his entire legal position. He goes back to prison, bail gets permanently revoked, and his lawyers will withdraw all civil suits when prosecutors offer reduced criminal charges in exchange for dropping the harassment litigation. But you'll face criminal prosecution, substantial fines at minimum, more likely probation, possibly actual federal prison time. Martin sat with that information for 3 days. Didn't call anyone, didn't ask for advice, just sat with the choice between protecting himself and protecting Sharon. On the 4th day, he compiled everything. Account numbers he'd memorized years ago. Transaction histories he'd kept as insurance back when he'd thought insurance meant leverage. Communications showing Randolph's clear bail violations. He sent it all anonymously to Sharon's legal team with enough context that they'd understand its significance without knowing its source. Sharon figured it out within 24 hours. Her investigative skills were too sophisticated for genuine anonymity. She appeared at his apartment that evening, somehow bypassing building security through sheer force of determined fury, and knocked on his door with intensity that suggested the door had personally offended her. Martin opened it to find Sharon looking simultaneously exhausted and incandescent with anger. "What did you do?" "I gave your lawyers what they needed to bury Randolph. You implicate yourself. Your fingerprints are all over that financial documentation because you used the exact same banking systems. I know. You'll be investigated, charged, prosecuted. You could go to prison, Martin, actually to federal prison. Probably, yes. Why?" She was shouting now, and Martin realized this was the first time Sharon had shown genuine emotion toward him, beyond carefully controlled contempt, since their initial confrontation in the snow 2 years ago. "Why would you sacrifice yourself for me when I've made it abundantly clear I don't want you in my life?" Martin's voice broke, and he let Sharon see every crack in the facade he'd maintained through public confession and financial ruin and the slow dismantling of everything he'd once thought made him valuable. Because 2 years ago, when you needed me, I had spreadsheets to review, conference calls to take, deals to close, and you ended up in a shelter while I was celebrating acquisitions in five-star hotels. I can't undo that. Can't rewind time and choose you when it would have actually mattered. But I can choose you now, even when the cost is everything I have left. Especially when the cost is everything I have left. That's not logical. That's not even strategic. No, it's not. It's the complete opposite of every calculation I made for 15 years, and maybe that's exactly the point. Maybe sacrificing something irreplaceable when no one's watching and you'll never get credit is the only way to prove you finally understand what irreplaceable actually means. Sharon stared at him, and Martin watched her process information that contradicted the narrative she'd built where he remained eternally, reliably selfish. I don't need you to save me. I've been saving myself for 2 years. I'm quite good at it by now. I know you don't need me, but you shouldn't have to fight battles alone when I have weapons that could help, and I'm choosing not to use them just to protect myself. Not because it makes me feel better about the past, because it's the right thing to do, and I've spent too long choosing smart over right. You're an idiot. Yeah, probably. But I'd rather be an idiotic person who helped than a calculating person who protected himself while watching you suffer again because I decided my comfort mattered more than your safety. Sharon left without another word, but she didn't return the information. She kept it. Randolph's legal cases collapsed within 2 weeks. The evidence Martin provided was overwhelming: clear bail violations, undisclosed assets in multiple jurisdictions, fraudulent financial statements submitted to divorce courts. Randolph was arrested again, bail was permanently revoked, and his lawyers withdrew all civil suits against Sharon when prosecutors offered reduced charges in exchange for dropping the harassment litigation. Sharon was vindicated completely and publicly. Federal investigators came for Martin on a cold November morning. The media coverage was immediate and predictable. Martin Hewitt faces new criminal investigation, and Hewitt's redemption arc includes federal charges. But something unexpected happened that Martin hadn't anticipated. Workers from the companies where he'd implemented reforms, people he'd never met personally, whose names he didn't know, started defending him publicly. They gave interviews to local news stations without any coordination or encouragement. Mr. Hewitt took pay cuts so we could have health care that covered our kids. My son needed surgery last year, and the old insurance policy wouldn't have covered it. The new policy did. That's the difference between someone who talks about change and someone who implements it even when it costs them everything. I was injured at work 3 years ago under the old management, got fired for missing shifts during recovery. Under Mr. Hewitt's new policies, I would have gotten paid leave and physical therapy. He didn't just change the policy after his article. He paid retroactive compensation to people like me who got screwed under the old system. Nobody asked him to do that, he just did it. The federal investigation dragged on for months. Martin paid enormous fines, millions in back taxes, penalties for offshore holdings he'd tried to forget about, restitution for financial violations he'd committed when building his empire. He accepted 18 months probation with community service requirements and regular check-ins with a probation officer. His net worth decreased from modest millions to less than $1 million total. Still comfortable by normal standards, but no longer meaningfully wealthy by any measure that his former life would have recognized. Through everything, Sharon remained publicly silent. No articles, no social media posts, no acknowledgement that Martin had sacrificed himself to protect her legal position. Until late one night, 3 months into Martin's probation, his phone buzzed with a text from her number. The number he'd never deleted despite knowing she'd blocked him years ago and had probably forgotten he still had it saved. "Are you okay?" Martin stared at those 3 words, the first direct contact Sharon had initiated in over 2 years, and felt something crack in his chest that had been calcified by guilt and loneliness, and the understanding that he deserved both. "I'm not wealthy anymore. I'm under probation. I'm unemployable in my old industry. But yeah, I'm okay. Better than I was when I had everything except self-respect." Her response came immediately. like she'd been waiting for his reply. Good. Then, after a pause long enough that Martin thought the conversation had ended, "You didn't have to do that. Sacrifice yourself for my legal battles." "I know I didn't have to, but I wanted to. Not for credit, not for forgiveness, not to make myself feel better about the past, because it was the right thing to do, and I'm trying to learn how to recognize the right thing and then actually choose it even when it costs me everything." Another long pause. Martin could see the typing indicator appear and disappear 3 times before her response finally came through. "I don't forgive you, Martin, but I acknowledge you've changed. That's something." Martin exhaled slowly, understanding in that moment that something from Sharon Grace was more valuable than absolution from anyone else, more valuable than his former billions, more valuable than any redemption narrative he could have constructed for public consumption. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you for acknowledging it. Don't thank me for basic observation, just keep being different. That's harder than one sacrifice. That's the actual work." "I will, for as long as it takes to prove it's genuine, for the rest of my life if that's what it takes." Sharon didn't respond again that night, but she didn't block him either, and Martin understood that this, Sharon considering whether he'd changed enough to exist in her peripheral awareness without causing pain, whether he'd sustained transformation long enough to warrant reconsideration as something other than the villain in her origin story, was progress measured in molecules rather than milestones, but molecules still mattered when you were trying to rebuild atomic structure from nothing, especially when you'd spent years building empires while ignoring that human connection had its own fundamental physics that couldn't be violated without consequence. Chapter 9. The moment you stop needing an ending is when one becomes possible. 6 months passed after Martin's investigation concluded. 6 months of rebuilding on a fundamentally different scale, consulting for ethical businesses that actually wanted ethics rather than reputation management, living in his modest apartment, discovering that days without board meetings and acquisition negotiations were paradoxically both longer and more substantial than the frantic schedule that had once defined his existence. He'd sold everything except genuine necessities by this point, donated most proceeds to organizations supporting women leaving domestic violence situations and workers displaced by corporate restructuring. His apartment was modest, his car was practical, his wardrobe consisted of actual clothing rather than status symbols with designer labels. Sharon's career had achieved stratospheric trajectory during those same months. Her investigative show was renewed for a 2nd season with expanded budget and creative control. Her book about corporate accountability became a bestseller, spent 12 weeks on major lists, got optioned for a limited series. She was invited to speak at conferences globally, her analysis cited in congressional hearings and policy discussions about labor reform and business ethics. They'd had no contact beyond that single text exchange after his investigation. Martin followed her career from careful distance, watching her build something magnificent from the ashes of what his negligence had burned. He dated no one, had no interest in dating anyone, focused entirely on becoming someone whose stated values actually aligned with his daily actions instead of contradicting them. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late April. Delilah's number appeared on his phone screen. Sharon's mother, whom he'd never spoken to directly, but whose signature shared space with his mother's on a document that had altered Sharon's entire life trajectory. "Mr. Hewitt, this is Delilah, Sharon's mother. I apologize for bothering you, but I didn't know who else to call." Her voice was panicked, breathless, stretched thin by fear. "What's wrong? What happened?" "I'm at Mercy Hospital. I had a heart attack this afternoon. They're saying it was serious. Sharon's in California for a work conference, and all the flights are grounded because of the storm system. She can't get here until tomorrow at earliest, and I'm alone and I'm scared, and she gave me your number months ago in case of emergency, but I don't know if you'd even want to." "Which hospital?" "I'm 20 minutes away." "You don't have to do this. You don't owe me anything." "Which hospital, Delilah?" "Mercy, on Roosevelt Avenue." "I'm already leaving. I'll be there soon." Martin grabbed his coat and drove through rain that made visibility entirely optional, arriving at the hospital just as they were moving Delilah from emergency to the cardiac ICU. He found her room through the kind of determined navigation that hospital bureaucracy tries to prevent, and when he walked in, Delilah was crying softly, alone in a space designed for critical care rather than human comfort. "Mr. Hewitt, you actually came." "Of course I came." He pulled a chair to her bedside, careful not to disturb any of the monitoring equipment. "Sharon's on her way. I talked to her while I was driving over. She'll be here as soon as the flights resume. In the meantime, you're not alone. I'm staying. You didn't have to do this. After what I did to Sharon, after I took that money from your mother and destroyed my daughter's life for $200,000. You hurt her badly. I hurt her badly. We both failed someone we should have protected. But Sharon survived both of us, which means maybe we're not as powerful as we thought we were. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's even good." Delilah's cardiac monitor beeped steadily, reassuring in its mechanical consistency, and Martin stayed through shift changes and visiting hour restrictions that he simply ignored, convincing nurses through sheer persistent insistence that he was family, until Sharon could arrive to make that claim legitimately. She appeared at 4 in the morning, soaked from the rain, eyes red from crying during the entire flight and subsequent drive from the airport. Martin stood immediately when she entered, giving her space and clear path to reach her mother without any obstruction from him. "Mom. Oh God, Mom." "I'm okay, baby. I'm stable now. They said it was very close, but I'm stable. Mr. Hewitt stayed with me. He's been here all night." Sharon turned then, noticing Martin for the first time, and her expression was complicated beyond any description Martin could have attempted. "You stayed. You called me. Well, your mother called, but you gave her my number for emergencies. So when someone asks for help, I show up now. I'm trying to compensate for all the times I didn't show up when it actually mattered." Sharon looked at him, really looked, taking in his exhaustion and rain-soaked clothes from the walk through the hospital parking lot, and the way he'd positioned himself carefully on the opposite side of the room to give her and Delilah maximum space for their reunion. "Thank you." Those two words felt absolutely monumental. The doctors came in shortly after and updated them together, explaining Delilah's treatment plan and recovery timeline in the careful language that medical professionals use when outcomes are positive, but were recently uncertain. Sharon asked thorough, research-oriented questions with the same investigative approach that characterized her journalism. Martin stayed quiet, present without inserting himself into family dynamics that weren't his to navigate. When Delilah finally fell asleep under the influence of medications, Sharon gestured Martin toward the hallway. They stood near a vending machine that probably hadn't been restocked since the previous administration, both of them exhausted beyond measure, and the fluorescent lighting made everything feel simultaneously surreal and harshly illuminated. "You could have just called me, told me what was happening. Your mother was scared and alone. She needed someone physically present, not just a voice on the phone telling her you were coming eventually." "But why you specifically? Why did she even have your number?" Martin hesitated, choosing words carefully. "A few months ago, after everything that happened with my mother and yours, Delilah reached out. She was starting therapy, working on rebuilding your relationship. She asked me for perspective about making amends to someone when you don't have any right to expect forgiveness. I gave her my number in case she ever needed advice from someone who was equally complicit in causing you pain. I genuinely didn't expect her to ever actually use it, but I'm really glad she did." Sharon's eyes were wet now, exhaustion and relief and confusion mixing into something that looked like grief for all the years they'd lost to his negligence and her survival. "I'm so exhausted, Martin. Exhausted from being angry all the time. Exhausted from carrying what you did, what she did, what Randolph did. I'm just so tired of people being the primary reason I hurt." "I know." And then you show up when my mother has a heart attack, and you sit with her for 8 hours, even though she literally helped your mother traffic me into an abusive marriage, and I genuinely don't know what to do with that information. You don't have to do anything with it. I didn't stay for credit or forgiveness or any kind of recognition. I stayed because she was alone and scared, and I spent 2 years making you feel alone and scared every single time I cancelled plans or deprioritized you or forgot you existed between meetings. Maybe I can't fix the past, but I can choose to show up differently now. Sharon broke then, crying in the way that people cry when exhaustion removes every defensive structure they've carefully constructed, and Martin stayed nearby without touching, respecting boundaries even when every instinct he had left suggested otherwise. I don't want to need you. I built an entire existence on specifically not needing you. You don't need me. You're literally the most self-sufficient person I've ever encountered. But needing someone and accepting help from someone are genuinely different things. And accepting help doesn't make you weak or dependent, it just makes you human. They sat in the waiting room until dawn broke over the city, sometimes talking and sometimes just sitting in silence that felt more contemplative than confrontational. Sharon fell asleep briefly, with her head tilting toward Martin's shoulder without any conscious decision, and he remained absolutely motionless, terrified that moving would wake her and end this fragile moment of proximity that he had no right to but was grateful for anyway. When she woke up, embarrassed, Martin just smiled with exhaustion and something gentler. You needed rest. I wasn't going anywhere. You waited all night. You really didn't have to do that. I know I didn't have to, but I wanted to. Because 2 years ago, when you needed me to wait, to be patient, to prioritize you over literally anything else, I couldn't be bothered. So tonight, I had nowhere more important to be than right here. Over terrible coffee and mediocre toast at a 24-hour diner across the street from the hospital, they talked, really talked, for the first time without anger or professional distance, mediating every single word. Why didn't you fight for me? 2 years ago when I ended things, why didn't you try to stop me? Martin considered lying, considered offering some explanation that would make him seem less terrible in retrospect, chose brutal honesty instead because that's all he had left to offer. Because I genuinely didn't understand what fighting for someone looked like. I thought working harder, making more money, building the empire, that was how I demonstrated love and commitment. I didn't comprehend that love is presence first and provision second, that showing up consistently matters infinitely more than providing expensive things. And by the time I finally understood any of that, you were already gone, and honestly, I didn't think I deserved any kind of second chance after failing you so comprehensively. You didn't deserve one. I know. But I'm trying to become someone who would have deserved it originally, even if that transformation means never actually getting another chance with you. Even if I'm doing this work just to become someone I can tolerate inhabiting. Sharon was quiet for a long time, processing. I'm not ready for this, for us, for whatever this could possibly be. I know you're not ready. But I'm not saying never anymore. Martin's breath caught audibly in his chest. I'm saying maybe, very distant maybe, extremely conditional maybe that's dependent on you continuing to be this person instead of performing this person until I trust you enough and then reverting to who you were before. I'll be this person for the rest of my life, Sharon, whether you're in my life observing it or not, because going back to who I was isn't even possible anymore. That person is uninhabitable now. Over the following week, Martin visited Delilah daily while Sharon was managing work obligations and trying to maintain some semblance of her career momentum. He didn't do it for credit or to insert himself into Sharon's life through proximity to her mother. He did it because Delilah needed company during recovery, and Martin had learned that showing up mattered more than grand gestures or expensive demonstrations. Sharon noticed, didn't comment on it directly, but she started texting him updates about her mother's condition and occasional medical questions, and those texts felt like trust measured in increments too microscopic to name but too significant to ignore or dismiss. On the day Delilah was finally discharged, Sharon asked Martin to help transport her mother home. They drove in careful silence, Delilah in the back seat watching her daughter and the man who'd once broken her daughter's heart navigate proximity like diplomats negotiating fragile peace treaties. At Delilah's apartment, after ensuring she was settled with everything she needed for recovery, Sharon walked Martin to his car in the parking lot. "Thank you for this entire week, for showing up. You don't have to thank me for doing what any decent person would do. I do have to thank you, because you didn't have to do any of it, and you did it anyway without asking for anything in return." Sharon paused then, considering words carefully before speaking them. "Coffee next week, Thursday afternoon, that diner we went to. I'll be there. This isn't forgiveness, Martin. I know it's not. This isn't us dating or reconciling or any kind of romantic narrative you might be constructing. I understand completely. This is just me exploring whether we can exist in the same physical space without me hating you or you disappointing me. That's literally all I'm offering right now." "That's everything. That's more than everything." Sharon almost smiled then. Almost. "Don't make me regret this decision." "I won't. I promise I won't." She walked back toward her mother's apartment building, and Martin drove home with hands shaking on the steering wheel, understanding that Sharon Grace had just offered him something infinitely precious and absolutely terrifying. The possibility that people could actually change enough to warrant genuine reconsideration from the people they'd hurt most severely. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not redemption. Just the simple acknowledgement that history didn't have to dictate every single possible future, that the past could inform without imprisoning. That transformation, if sustained long enough and proven through consistent action rather than words, might eventually earn the right to be witnessed and considered rather than automatically dismissed. And for Martin Hewitt, who'd spent 2 years learning that redemption was measured in years of changed behavior rather than moments of dramatic confession, that acknowledgement was everything he'd been working toward without quite daring to hope he'd ever actually receive it. Chapter 10. The reunion that rewrote what endings could mean. 2 years after that first hospital coffee, Sharon Grace stood in the building where Martin Hewitt had once thrown Christmas parties while she stood outside freezing in the snow. Except now she owned the building, and tonight's gala celebrated her foundation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the journalists who'd requested interviews about the symbolic reversal. Sharon had declined every request. The reversal wasn't symbolic. It was literal, material, and entirely intentional. She'd purchased the property when Martin's downsized company vacated, transforming it into headquarters for her foundation, supporting women rebuilding after divorce and family abandonment. Tonight was the foundation's annual fundraiser. Christmas again, full circle. Snow was falling outside the same floor-to-ceiling windows where Martin had once stood looking down at her with champagne in hand while she documented his building for an investigation. Martin had been invited, not by Sharon, but by Delilah, who now directed the foundation's counseling programs and maintained that everyone deserved to witness the work their failures had inadvertently inspired. Sharon had initially protested the invitation, then realized her protest was about control rather than genuine objection. If she was truly past what Martin had done, his presence shouldn't threaten her carefully constructed equilibrium. He arrived at dusk, standing outside in falling snow, looking up at the building with an expression Sharon recognized from her own face 2 years ago. Uncertainty about whether entry represented permission or trespass. She went to him, coat wrapped over her emerald gown, breath visible in December air. "You're going to freeze out here." Martin turned, and Sharon catalogued how the 2 years had continued carving him into someone fundamentally different, thinner in a way that suggested asceticism rather than illness. His coat was nice, but clearly not expensive. His car in the parking lot was practical rather than luxury. Everything about his presentation communicated he'd learned to exist without excess. "I wasn't sure if I should come inside. Your mother invited me, but this is your night, your triumph. I don't want my presence to contaminate it. Sharon studied him with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent years learning to see through surfaces. You've changed significantly, even in just the last 2 years since we started having occasional coffee. 13 times we've had coffee, exactly 13 times in 2 years. But who's counting? Martin smiled, sad and self-aware. I am, every single one of them. Why are you really here tonight? Your mother thought it was time. Time for me to see what you built from nothing. Time for you to decide if I belong in this room or if my presence is still painful enough that I should leave immediately. Sharon looked at the snow, the building, the man who'd once made her feel completely invisible. Come inside. It's too cold out here for philosophical conversations about boundaries. The gala was magnificent. Hundreds of women whose stories paralleled Sharon's, abandoned, divorced, financially devastated, rebuilt through sheer determination, filled rooms that had once hosted men celebrating acquisitions built on others' suffering. The transformation was absolute and deliberate. Martin stayed carefully peripheral, watching Sharon command her empire with the kind of authority that comes from earning rather than inheriting power. People swarmed her constantly, and she handled the attention with grace that suggested she'd learned to receive admiration without deflecting it as weakness. Sharon's friends found him near the bar eventually, the jury reconvening. Imani spoke first. You've been funding this place, anonymously, for 2 years straight. Sharon's work is genuinely important. Keisha tilted her head. You never took credit for the donations, never used them to try inserting yourself into her life or buying access. Credit isn't the point of charitable giving. The women being helped are the point. Jade almost smiled, which from a therapist felt like provisional approval. 2 years of consistent behavior is a meaningful sample size for evaluating pattern change. We've been watching closely. When Sharon took the stage for her keynote, the room quieted with genuine respect rather than social obligation. Her speech was powerful, weaving economic statistics with personal narrative about rebuilding from abandonment. She never named Martin explicitly, but twice her eyes found him in the crowd, and those moments felt like acknowledgement that he was context to her story rather than its protagonist. We talk about redemption like it happens instantaneously. Someone apologizes, and we're supposed to forgive immediately. But redemption is years. It's someone demonstrating through sustained action that they've fundamentally changed their value system. And here's what I've learned. Forgiveness isn't required. Ever. We don't owe forgiveness to anyone, regardless of how much they've changed or how long they've worked at transformation. She paused, and the room held its collective breath. But acknowledgement, acknowledging that someone has genuinely put in the work, that they're measurably different than they were, that's something we can choose to give, not for them, for ourselves, to release the weight of who they were and make space for who they might be becoming. The applause was sustained and heartfelt. After, as guests mingled, Martin didn't approach Sharon, just existed in her space without demanding attention, which felt like growth measured in restraint. Near midnight, as crowds thinned, Sharon found him in a corridor lined with photographs of women the foundation had helped. You stayed the entire evening. You said I could come inside. You didn't specify departure time. I genuinely didn't know if you'd actually come tonight. Your mother invited me, and beyond that, I wanted to see what you built, wanted to witness your triumph, even if I could only do it from the margins. And you're magnificent, more magnificent than I ever understood when I had the privilege of being in your life the first time. They stood in silence that felt less like conflict and more like two people figuring out if they could occupy the same space without destruction. I don't forgive you, Martin. I know you don't. I don't know if I ever will. That's completely acceptable. But I acknowledge you've changed, truly, fundamentally changed. And I'm tired of carrying anger about who you were when I can clearly see who you're trying to be now. What is possible between us? Sharon took a breath. I genuinely don't know. That's what makes this terrifying. We don't have to figure it out tonight. No, but we do have to be honest. What do you actually want, Martin? Martin had prepared for this question for 2 years and still felt completely unprepared. I want you in my life, in whatever capacity you'll allow. If that's occasional coffee every few months, I'll treasure it. If it's friendship, I'll honor it carefully. If it's something more someday, if you ever trust me enough for more, I'll spend the rest of my life proving it wasn't a mistake. But I don't need an answer tonight. I don't need an answer this year. I'll wait as long as necessary because becoming someone worthy of you matters infinitely more than whether you ever actually choose me. What if the answer is never? What if I decide I acknowledge your change but still choose not to have you in my life? Then I'll respect that completely, and I'll be grateful for the 13 coffees and tonight, and I'll keep supporting your foundation from distance, and I'll live with the knowledge that some damage is permanent, regardless of how much you change afterward. You've really accepted that possibility. I've had 4 years to accept it. Changed behavior doesn't erase past harm. I can be better without being forgiven for who I was, and that has to be enough for me. Sharon felt tears coming. I'm not ready for this. For us. For whatever this could be. Okay. But I'm not saying never anymore. Martin's breath caught audibly. I'm saying possibility, distant conditional possibility, dependent on you continuing to be this person for years more. Music drifted from the ballroom. Dance with me. They moved in silence, and Sharon catalogued every sensation, his heartbeat against her palm, the careful way he held her, close enough to be real but distant enough to respect boundaries, the way he smelled like something simple now instead of expensive status signaling. It doesn't feel like suffocating anymore. What does it feel like? Like something I'm not ready to name yet, but not painful anymore. The song ended. I'm going to continue my life, my career, my foundation, my everything, with or without you. I know. But if you're in it, if I decide that someday it's entirely on my terms, my timeline, I'll wait. Years, potentially. I've learned patience. Martin left soon after. Outside, snow was falling harder, and he stood by his car looking up one final time. Sharon appeared in the window, the same window where he'd once stood looking down, and when their eyes met across distance, she raised her hand. One small wave, not a promise, just acknowledgement, the beginning of possibility, and Sharon watched him leave without pain for the first time in 4 years. Just curiosity about whether the man he'd become could sustain himself long enough for her to trust his change was permanent rather than performed. She turned from the window to find her friends watching. So? Imani asked. So we'll see. Maybe yes. Probably complicated, but possible. When did you become someone who gives second chances? Sharon smiled, small and private and genuine. When I realized second chances aren't about who someone was. They're about who you're becoming. And I'm becoming someone who doesn't let the past write every future. I write it. And maybe that future has space for someone who finally learned people matter more than empires. The snow fell on a building she owned, on a life she'd built, on a future she was writing, and for the first time since Martin Hewitt broke her heart 4 years ago, Sharon Grace wasn't standing in the cold, looking up at someone else's party. She was inside her own empire, deciding whether the man who once left her freezing had finally earned the warmth of her world. The answer wasn't yes yet, but it was no longer number. The end.